The origins of dowsing can be traced back over 2,400 years ago. Perhaps the first written evidence of an early form of rod divination comes from the Greek historian Herodotus. Around 444 BC, Herodotus wrote of the Scythians, fierce warriors inhabiting the land north of the Black Sea in what is now southern Russia. As historical record, Herodotus wrote that Scythia has an abundance of soothsayers who foretell the future by means of a number of willow wands. Dowsing makes another appearance, this time in Germany, almost 1,400 years after Herodotus. In 936 AD, an antique gold coin, minted to commemorate the discovery of a silver mine on Rammelsberg Mountain, displays a man holding a forked stick in the well-known dowsing position while walking across the ground. In more recent history, about 500 years ago, a scholar by the name of Georgius Agricola documented the various uses 16th century dowsers applied to their rods. A woodcut from Agricola's historical archive shows a man among miners taking a limb from a tree to serve as a rod. Once again, it displays dowsers looking for ore and clearly showing miners where to dig. Though forms of dowsing continued to be practiced by many, the phenomenon was considered mysterious or even magical. Those that studied dowsing during these periods often speculated as to the formulation of proper techniques and methods, many personalizing their process. As a result, nobody could be entirely sure what process was the most efficient, or more importantly, why or how dowsing worked. In 1630, Bernard Cassius and Athanasius Kircher were some of the first to attempt to study dowsing from a more rigorous scientific perspective. Kircher, after refusing to accept a magical interpretation of dowsing, spent much time trying to understand the mechanism by which the process worked. Though he ultimately failed, he paved the way for later efforts to examine dowsing separate from any magical theories. Despite the lack of scientific understanding and widespread skeptical resistance, even as we approach the 21st century, parts of society continued to embrace the notion that dowsing worked and could be an effective tool in one's daily life. Today, articles continue to appear in mainstream publications, including the Reader's Digest, the Washington Post, and the official magazine of the Smithsonian Institution, all attempting to provide additional insight into this ancient skill, supplying evidence that there was more to dowsing than meets the eye. Unfortunately, many misconceptions generated throughout the last several hundred years regarding what dowsing could be used for and why or how it worked have carried through to today's practices, such as the notion that dowsing rods are controlled by some sort of invisible force, or even the idea that one is required to use certain tools like rods or sticks. But probably the greatest misconception still widely believed today is that dowsing can only be utilized to locate conductive substances such as water or metals. But without extensive and conclusive modern-day research, nobody could know for sure the mechanics behind dowsing, or even if it worked at all. In the early 1970s, as dowsing continued to capture people's interest, the public was unaware that this ability was about to be put through the ultimate test. A scientific endeavor utilizing several of the most brilliant physicists and researchers who would exhaust the use of every modern technological tool the world had to offer. Not only to uncover the secret behind dowsing, but all related extrasensory perception. This time, the subconscious mind wouldn't be studied out of curiosity. It would be studied out of necessity.
We're trying to track down hostages. They're being held by Islamic terrorist groups in the Middle East. We're trying to track down narco traffickers, contraband. terrorists. They assigned us to find terrorists or missiles that were being moved around in the Middle East. And so we were looking for, I and my colleagues were looking for something more to employ, some technique, some device or tool, something that would help us to be able to actually find things. Some scientists out at Stanford Research Institute, which eventually became known as SRI, among them was a physicist named Hal Puthoff, were working on a problem. The CIA had noted that the Soviets were seriously looking into spending a lot of money and researching into parapsychology kind of effects. And the CIA approached Puthoff and his associates and asked them to do some serious research in this for various reasons. They were good choices for that. And so they started researching it and discovered there were applications that actually not only were the Soviets probably on to something, but that we could actually use our own people using these parapsychological skills or abilities to spy on the Russians.
I was at Stanford Research Institute and doing laser research and so on. And I had circulated a proposal for doing some exotic particle physics experiments. And just by chance, in a social situation, Ingo Swann, who was claimed a well-known psychic, wrote me a letter and said, well, I see you're interested in exotic physics, so you may be interested in the kind of things I do, which is psychokinesis. Ordinarily, I would just throw that in the trash, but in this case, he included a copy of a report from City College in New York where he had actually done some successful experiments. So just on a lark, I invited him out, and we did some experiments, and they were quite remarkable, and so I circulated them around to my physics colleagues, and then pretty soon the CIA showed up at my doorstep. And they said, have we been looking for you? I said, well, why? They said, well, we've been tracking Soviet research in this area for several years. They're spending a lot of money at some of their best institutes with their best people. But scientists in the West don't even think there is such a thing as ESP.
The CIA and the United States military launched an aggressive top-secret research program to discover effective protocols to utilize the inherent abilities of the human mind for military operations. This research engagement became known as the Remote Viewing Program.
Remote viewing is a process whereby someone accesses, by some mental means, some location that's remote in time or space and describes it by means that you can't just assign to analysis or intuition or logic.
The name remote viewing, or RV, is actually a misnomer. It may be more accurately described as remote sensing or remote perception. Resulting from countless studies conducted with Ingo Swann, a military contracted subject who many refer to as the father of remote viewing, findings suggest that all humans contain an inherent ability to gather information about any place, person, thing, or event in the past, present, or future through the subconscious mind. Remote viewing is commonly misunderstood by the public and actually refers to a specific, teachable protocol that virtually anyone can follow. In theory, it's as easy as learning to play the piano. As a result, misconceptions about individuals believed to possess a unique natural ability to obtain information about future events or hidden targets quickly dissipated as a psychic function and began to be viewed simply as a skill, one that each person possesses to a certain degree. During early military operations, a trained viewer would receive a target from a project manager. However, the target would be encoded in a manner in which the viewer could not possibly decipher what the true target was. Though the process may seem confusing, think of it as a way of encryption. It was a method utilized in order to keep the targets blind to the viewer. The idea is that if the subconscious was truly at work, your analytical mind could remain hidden to the target, and yet your subconscious mind should already know what it is that you are seeking. The first basic protocols were developed to help force the mind to follow a specific set of steps to call forth information in a set sequence directly from the subconscious mind, and variations of this are still used today. the viewer would begin to follow the specific sequence of steps, starting with sensory perceptions, writing down colors, textures, smells, tastes, and so on, and eventually recording dimensional contacts, including motions and densities. Even with the initial protocols, it was crucial to move quickly and without delay, without thinking, never deviating from the process. The descriptors were recorded across several pages, calling forth data directly from the subconscious. After about 45 minutes in session, the data was then translated into a sketch which contained the hidden target. Dowsing, though functioning through a very different protocol from remote viewing, contains many similarities with regards to brain and subconscious function. However, the secret behind dowsing wouldn't be discovered until later in the military program. And while it may sound like remote viewing or dowsing was taken right out of a science fiction movie, the CIA and military intelligence couldn't ignore the shocking results. Although the research was still in its infancy, little could anyone imagine that the program would become a 20-year-long, multi-million-dollar endeavor that would end up changing the face of warfare forever.
Well, we were doing remote viewing in general for the U.S. military, specifically for Army INSCOM, Intelligence and Security Command. And then it turned out that rather than getting descriptions of particular sites, they had a lot of requirements, operational requirements for finding things. For example, a bug in a room, the location of a downed plane, location of an individual, an agent, say. And so they asked us, could we do the inverse of remote viewing? Rather than having a case where we knew where the location was, what was there, this was a case of, well, we know what it is we're looking for, we just don't know where it is.
We were tasked on various hostage situations in the Middle East, whereas Terry Waite, whereas Colonel Higgins, whereas a number of other hostages that were being held by Hezbollah and some other friends. And we could actually describe the setting that these people were in, but when it came to actually putting our finger on a map and saying they're here, we were not able to do that. And so we started looking into ways of doing this, and one of those things we hit on was dowsing. I found out later that we were in a way reinventing the wheel, because in the early days of the remote viewing program, they had experimented with dowsing as well, tried some things out. But in transition from one set of personnel to another, some of that institutional knowledge had gotten lost, and so here we were trying to rediscover that. And another book was published called The Divining Hand by Christopher Bird. It's become kind of the handbook of dowsing, and it's very well written, but it had some startling revelations in it. It noted that a certain dowser named Louis Metacia had actually taught the U.S. military how to dowse during Vietnam, searching for hidden tunnels, searching for landmines, booby traps, and things like that. And that in fact, there was even a newspaper article published that reported on the Marines actually using this skill in Vietnam to some success.
We built a combat village to train troops who are going to Vietnam. They taught the Marines in Camp Pendleton. I taught the ones at Camp Lejeune, they went over there. I taught the Marines at Quantico. I'll tell you what they found that I never even knew, which I thought was very significant. They found the communication system of the Viet Cong. He said the Viet Cong bury their orders in bamboo tubes and put them under the trail. I said, you're kidding. He said, no. He said, they found them. See, once you tell the Marines the system and they learn it, all they do is turn them loose and they'll find it, whatever you want to find. They knew these guys were dowsing everything in the book. Once you show them and they get results, then they're pretty well believers.
Even though some success with dowsing was reported in Vietnam before the official remote viewing program began, some military researchers were skeptical that past recorded successes were simply a matter of luck rather than human intuition.
In the beginning, we thought this was just some peculiar aspect of human consciousness or whatever. But as we gathered a lot of data, of course, it wasn't all perfect remote viewing, and we could see that there were certain patterns to the errors and certain patterns to what was correctly perceived and so on. And so as we began looking into those patterns and then looking into the general research on consciousness and perception in general, we found that in fact our data was not skewed off to the side, but actually seemed to match into areas that were well understood in consciousness and perception. Specifically, the remote viewing seemed to be mediated more by the right hemisphere of the brain, which tends to be a pattern recognition, holistic kind of integration unit, as opposed to the left hemisphere, which is more of analysis and reading and mathematics and that kind of thing. And then we would look at the data coming out of, say, stroke victims, where maybe the left hemisphere would have had a stroke, and so people struggle with trying to describe what they're seeing in their ordinary environment. And the kind of errors they would make were exactly the kind of errors remote viewers were making. So in the end, we began to realize that this seems to be integrated into our general perceptual and consciousness functions, fitting hand in glove with other things that are near. Actually, remote viewing should probably be called remote sensing, because we found as time went on that drawings tended to, for example, be better than descriptions of visual scenes. And so it seems like the data comes in at kind of a kinesthetic level in the motor system. And so once we realized that, then the training techniques that were developed began with just trying to put down sketches, not trying to visualize what the scenes are. And that seemed to be a help. So there's sort of a connection there with dowsing, in the sense that people who dowse with, say, forked sticks tend to get a ideomotor response. And so that seems to be a general feature of this kind of functioning.
There have been a number of scientific experiments attempting to verify whether dowsing works or not. What's interesting is that some of the best experiments weren't actually known until just recently. These were the ones that were done in secret, under contract to the CIA or the Army or whoever happened to be providing the funding at the time, in support of the remote viewing program.
Starting out with simple experiments like hiding things in boxes and envelopes, but then our remote viewers insisted on doing something more challenging, like describing sites where somebody was sent at random. And what really set it off with a heavy spark was that we viewed some classified facilities and got data that was thought to be not obtainable by this kind of thing.
The original idea, when they were fielding the MX missile, was a response to one of the big Soviet missiles that had just recently been introduced, was because the Soviet missiles were now more accurate, they could take out our missile silos on first strike, and that was a big worry. If the Soviets could take out our weapons, our nuclear weapons, right off on their first firing, then we could be left powerless and not be able to touch the Soviet Union back, which counteracted the mutual deterrence problem. So the MX basing plan, the idea behind that was that you had a bunch of shelters on the desert, and then you shuttled the missile between these shelters, and so the Soviets had no idea which shelter they were in.
The MX missile system, the so-called shell game, that was being looked at in the Carter administration, where the idea was to have 20 missile silos located in a circle someplace, and then an underground railroad train that would shuttle the missile from one location to another. And so we also did an exploration of was there a way to defeat that. Specifically, it was a threat analysis study. Was there a way for the Soviets to defeat the MX system? One of our consultants, Charlie Tart, at University of California, Davis, had set up a system whereby he had basically a computer screen that had 10 circles on it, and there was a random number generator program within a computer that chose one of those as being the target, but didn't display it on the screen. And then the subject had to push a button, and then the target would be changed, its position would be changed, and have to do it again, and so on. And so we had one excellent subject who did 500 trials, and you'd expect 1 out of 10 by chance. And in fact, she averaged 1 out of 4. And so we had the data from that experiment, and so we decided to mock up an MX scenario with 10 silos. And we had a very sophisticated statistical averaging program called sequential sampling that we used. And so we ran that set of data through the statistical analysis program, and within that number of trials, we were able to do 12 attempts at finding which silo was the missile in this simulation. 12 out of 12, we got the right answer. We had no misses. So the probability of doing that by chance was 1 in a trillion.
The MX missile experiments provided the realization that the U.S. military could indeed utilize dowsing or remote viewing to gather data that couldn't be obtained by any other means. But then, hypothetically, so could the enemy. This was now becoming an issue of national security. Although early experiments provided statistically significant results, including accuracy uncovering the location of hidden nuclear warheads, it wasn't a solidified system. The program was still young, and researchers strived to create more effective protocols. The potential, however, was undeniable.
The idea behind all of these statistical procedures was that people can do this better than chance, but it's not terrifically better than chance. I mean, it'd be unusual for a dowser to tell me to go dig somewhere for a treasure on a single shot. But with the statistical application that would come from the application of these procedures, we get up 60, 70, 80% hit rates. So even if you're off, if you're out there doing a search, let's say you're doing a search for a downed airplane, or you're searching for a submarine, or whatever, simply starting with the square that the person, that the remote viewers or the dowsers have ticked off, is going to save you time. I mean, we calculated how much time would be saved, and in many cases, roughly 60% of the time would be saved if you at least started from the square chosen by a dowser. When I talk about statistical significance, you know, you hear numbers like 1 in 100, say, or the odds of getting it by chance are 1 in 100. You really have to put that in perspective. I mean, it's as if you had a bag of 99 white balls and 1 black ball, and you ask a person to reach in and only pull out the black ball. If they're successful, that's odds of 1 in 100. So then when you realize that in some of these experiments we got odds of 1 in 50,000, it's a really extremely significant result.
With tests now utilizing updated protocols achieving accuracy rates up to 80%, it was time for the military to move the research program into real-world operations.
There were a number of experiments, and there were a number of successful dowsing operations done in which actual people were captured and materials recovered using dowsing.
There's a procedure in addition to dowsing, which we would just call map dowsing. Here's your 20 by 20 grid, and you want to have somebody sort of attempt to determine where. And by the way, we had very good statistical procedures for that, because you could do a statistical analysis of, well, how close were you to the target? You didn't have to get right on it. And another approach we used was just simply the simple remote viewing, and that is have somebody remote view, let's say, a downed aircraft, and sort of target in on the aircraft, and then try to pull back in the remote viewing and describe the surrounding terrain. In one case, for a plane that went down in Zaire, that was basically how the plane was located. That is, the person was able to say, well, there's where the mountains are, there's where the river is, etc. And then when they got out a map of the area, they said, well, this looks like this region. And I think they were like within 5 miles, and the plane was found. It was a Soviet plane that had gone down in Zaire, and we wanted to get to it before the Russians did, because it was a very valuable piece of apparatus. And in fact, we sent people in and just as they got to the target site, some natives were carrying pieces of the plane out. So, in fact, this actually worked.
The use of remote viewing and dowsing in these real-world operations were also successful, but in addition, studies from thousands of session results provided another shocking realization. Could dowsing and remote viewing actually be learned?
There was definitely a learning effect shown in a number of these experiments, that people who had perhaps marginal dowsing skills at the start of the experiment actually showed that their performance improved as they went on and got more practice at it. Showed that there actually was statistically significant effects when you measured these things scientifically. And that data is just now coming out.
But what we found was that in a number of cases, people improved over time. So I think those learning trends, they were certainly real. They were statistically significantly real. Certainly in ordinary remote viewing, we found that with repeated trials, people did improve. So my hypothesis going in for the dowsing would be that with many repeated trials with some technique, improvement might be expected.
In 1995, after 23 years of successful operations, policy changes within the CIA forced the program, now known as Stargate, into declassification. Trained military personnel, including expert Paul H. Smith, retired and soon began providing these once top-secret protocols to the public. Advancements in dowsing and other ESP skills didn't stop with the declassification of the military program. As the private sector became aware of the previous scientific research, new public interest arose. Funding and new experimentation through private research organizations and instructors continued to make dowsing more efficient with newer, streamlined protocols and increasingly effective training methods. Now, modern dowsing was free to be used by anyone who was willing to give it a try, including employees with major telephone and utility companies.
The routine to hunt for telephone lines that were buried in the ground is to use this very elaborate and very expensive technology developed by AT&T Bell Laboratory scientists. It involved a very powerful signal generator and a very sensitive receiver. What they would do is they would work from one end of the telephone line that was buried, send a strong electrical signal through it, and then use the sensitive receiver and wander all over the countryside looking for the other end of the telephone line or where the signal was being transmitted underground along the length of that line. What they actually did, they never actually pulled out this kit containing this very expensive AT&T Bell Laboratory equipment. Instead, what they did is they took some pieces of pipe, some heavy gauge copper wire, they bent the copper wires into 90-degree angles, affixed them to the pipes, and they dowsed. And these were the same guys that had to dig these cables up. They had to dig some ditches and trenches very deep to get access to these cables to do whatever repair work or whatever construction work they were having to do. They had a 100% success rate in both not locating cables that were not underground in certain fields and being able to locate cable that were known to be under certain fields.
With dowsing growing in popularity, it didn't take long for people to realize that dowsing provided the potential for financial gain as well. People like Louis Matesha.
And I went to Virginia Beach, and we dug Virginia Beach up and found a tremendous number of coins. I felt so sorry for these metal detecting people. They came up and he had 35 cents and we had a bucket full of jewelry. No one has ever found jewelry on the beach like we did.
Mr. Matesha has released several books regarding treasure hunting with dowsing and was credited for several phenomenal discoveries, from locating buried silver bars to gold coins. His exploits are well documented, and to this day, he has been one of the most successful treasure hunters who have relied mostly on dowsing. But uses for dowsing didn't stop with treasure hunting. Gambling was also a target.
Blacks and reds on a roulette wheel. In fact, on the side, I and some friends did go to Lake Tahoe, and we did make money.
The stories abound. Dowsers winning the lottery, locating treasure, gambling, finding optimum stock market investments, and making important corporate and personal decisions. But what makes ESP-related skills such as dowsing actually work? The answer lies almost entirely with the subconscious mind. If you don't understand what the subconscious is, you're not alone. Many individuals may have an idea of when they receive information from this area of consciousness, but few understand it. Moments such as someone calling you on the phone just as you were thinking about them, or having the feeling that something unfortunate is happening or about to occur. Due to the lack of a better explanation, many refer to this as intuition, listening to your gut, or feeling a vibe. We can think of human consciousness as being divided into two regions. One is referred to as conscious awareness, and the other as the subconscious. As we proceed through each waking moment, the flood of smells, colors, sounds, tastes, and textures coming through our senses from the outside world are initially processed by our subconscious, not our conscious awareness. In fact, only a minuscule percentage of our environmental data is passed up and out of the subconscious and into our conscious awareness.
Well, the basis of remote viewing functionality isn't necessarily conscious interaction. The conscious aspects of it come last. We become aware of the remote viewing signal in the final stages of this. Most of the work is being done at what's generally known as a subconscious level. We talk in terms of the subconscious, the human subconscious, being connected with the rest of the universe in some interesting way that allows us to get information from places distant or hidden from us in some way. That all that information is available to the subconscious. It's just bringing up into conscious awareness where it can be useful that we run into difficulties. Notoriously, the subconscious is a repository for huge amounts of information, hundreds of thousands, millions of data bits that never make it up into conscious awareness. The bandwidth between subconscious and conscious is very narrow, and only a small amount of information ever comes to our cognition that we can actually work with in a conscious way. That's normal for any kind of sense, and when you add this ESP material in there, that's additional information that has to compete for that narrow bandwidth. So the trick is how do we get that information and make it available so that we can use it? Well, in remote viewing, the idea is you go through this process that we were trained in the military to access the information, the factual information, the visual information, in order for us to put it down on a piece of paper to express it and make it available for analysts.
But how does all of this explain the movement that occurs with dowsing rods? Let's think for a moment of a seismograph. This is a sensitive instrument designed to measure sudden movements in the earth, such as those caused by earthquakes. Some seismographs are so responsive that they can catch subtle variations from the other side of the planet. Dowsing rods work on this same principle, but instead of being affected by the Earth's subtle movements, they're affected by the human nervous system.
A lot of different theories about how dowsing works. The one that predominated for a long time was magnetism. The idea was that somehow the dowser was able to identify, or that there was a magnetic interaction between the dowser and the whatever's trying to be located. Now, this normally happened when the dowser was looking for water, or when the dowser was dowsing for minerals, or that kind of thing. That was the explanation that was used, and so they'd go and they'd dowse for it, and supposedly there's this attraction that caused the rods to work or whatever. In fact, later on, when it seemed apparent that there was no such force that was strong enough to make these rods work, particularly ones made out of wood, which are non-magnetic anyway, the feeling got to be that there was some inner mechanism that dowsers possessed. If you imagine yourself, for example, throwing a ball, even though it's just your imagination, the muscles that actually would be involved in throwing that ball actually get activated, and there are micro movements. Even though you never actually perform the motion, your muscles, in a way, perform it just at a much lower level, so that's not noticeable. And any time we have those kind of ideas of any kind of action or activity, our muscles respond at a very low level, so we're not even aware of it, but nonetheless it's happening. It's called the ideomotor response. when people go out to dowse, then that ideomotor response, they're expecting to find water, and so when they come to a place where they think water is, even though they're consciously trying very hard not to move the rods themselves, there's this involuntary motion of the muscles, which they're not even aware of, that cause the instrument, the pendulum, the rods, or whatever, to actually move.
The nervous system can generate subtle movements that are undetectable by our conscious awareness, so it's easy to understand why some dowsers may believe that an invisible force is responsible for moving their tools when they use L-rods or pendulums. But the question still remains, how does the subconscious know the answers to the information you are seeking in the first place, especially information that would seem to be unobtainable, such as locating buried treasure, or knowing what the next winning color on a roulette wheel will be? This aspect of ESP-related skill might still be one of the most mysterious and controversial topics in related scientific research. But thanks to quantum physics, a theory called quantum entanglement may provide new insight into how the subconscious can obtain what some previously believed to be unobtainable.
There may be explanations available in quantum physics, but in only a narrow scope of it, a feature called non-locality, which has the idea that things are entangled. There's several different terms for it: Bell's theorem, non-locality, quantum entanglement. There's some interesting features of that part of quantum theory that might explain not just things like dowsing, but also things like remote viewing or ESP in general. The idea here is that physical particles, not subatomic particles, that become entangled sometime in their past, they establish kind of a causative correlation, so that when they're separated by a long distance sometime in the future, if you affect one, then you have an instant effect on the other. Some of the results of the experiments in this suggest the sorts of things you encounter when you're doing dowsing or remote viewing.
At one time, physicists believed that atoms were the smallest form of matter in existence. Then we discovered atoms were actually comprised of even smaller particles called electrons, protons, and neutrons. Today, we now know that even deeper levels of subatomic particles exist in the composition of all matter, including biological life, forms of energy, and neurons, a component for human thought. As the name implies, entanglement occurs when two or more of these subatomic particles form an association at what is now believed to be the lowest level of subatomic existence. The association between these particles allow influences that affect one particle to occur to the other instantly and regardless of distance. As a result, some researchers refer to this as non-locality, nullifying the idea that information travels between the particles, and instead, that it is somehow already and instantaneously connected at another level of existence. While this may seem inconceivable to some, it's no more astonishing than at one time theorizing how the splitting of an atom could not only be possible, but that it could be harnessed as a destructive weapon. The advancements made within quantum mechanics, including the theory of quantum entanglement, may begin to provide the answers to how the subconscious mind is able to obtain information about an unknown or remote target, providing insight into the mechanics behind dowsing and all related ESP skill. With convincing military test results, personal experiences, and new sciences providing a glimpse into how our thought function may truly operate, why are there still skeptics?
Skeptics don't like dowsing because they have no way of explaining how it works. They are opposed to it for many of the same reasons they're opposed to ESP or similar kinds of so-called paranormal phenomena. There is no causative explanation that fits into any of our physical models. Until we come up with a really good theory that seems to satisfy them, aren't going to be pleased. They think this is literally spooky action at a distance, to borrow the words from Einstein. They think that it's all smoke and mirrors, and that all people involved in dowsing or ESP in general are charlatans or deluded, one or the other, and they want to reject all of this stuff because it seems to undermine the worldview that is currently held by science.
I had a teacher, and I traveled all over the United States, and I went to see the people that knew what they were talking about. And that's how I did it, because you can learn how to drive a car, but if you're going to be a race car driver, you're going to have to get the experts to teach you what to do. The beginner can do it. He just goes and see what happens, but it's all mental. You just focus, and it will do it. A lot of times, when I trained the Marines, I just threw a pencil on the ground. I said, walk over that pencil and see if those wires react. Whammo! They spread apart immediately. I said, that's the pencil. Now you put it on your head, tunnel. Now you walk around this village and find a tunnel. Whammo! It opened up right away.
One of the big issues with remote viewing is something called analytical overlay. And the problem with analytical overlay is that analytical overlay is also known as mental noise. These are the imaginings, the thoughts, the analyses, all the stuff that's going on in our conscious minds, expectation, that sort of thing, that end up contaminating the signal line. Let's say the target you're trying to describe is the Eiffel Tower. You as a remote viewer have no idea that it's the Eiffel Tower you're trying to describe. All you know is you've been given a set of coordinates or a certain number, and you are just going through the process. You get an impression of crisscrossing metallic structures and cold, bumpy, rivety kinds of things. You get these impressions, and that's all accurate about the Eiffel Tower. The problem is that it also matches the bridge that you drove over on your way into work that morning. And so all of a sudden your conscious awareness guesses, it jumps to a conclusion, oh, it's a bridge. Well, it isn't a bridge, it's the Eiffel Tower, but you have come to that false conclusion based on this interesting process. The same thing can happen with dowsing, where you may have conscious expectations that cause the ideomotor response. What you want to do is to be able to learn how to let the actual signal, dowsing signal, come through the subconscious and be the thing that motivates the indications of your devices, whatever device you're using, and not have it be your conscious awareness that's motivating that. And that's where, of course, the challenge is, to learn to tell the difference and to allow the one to operate and not allow the other one to interfere.
There's a certain portion that is natural ability, and the other portion is a lot of hard work and sticking to it. Everybody has it. It's just a part of your makeup, everybody's makeup. The ability to do it mostly rests, I think, with a person's own belief system, whether they believe they can do it or not, and how much work they want to put into it to be successful. The more practice, and you'll hear this by remote viewing teachers, the people who teach it today, and even in the unit, practice, practice, practice. There's a lot more to humans and people than just being analytical robots.